Okay, so in this little lesson, I'd like to look at the so-called Little Olivet Discourse of Jesus, and this is chapter 24 and 25. And in fact, if we throw chapter 23 into that mix, we've already looked at 23 a little bit. This is the largest block of teaching that we have in the entire New Testament. It's even longer than the Sermon on the Mount. And what's strange is that it's not much commented on, in the sense that when you hear Jesus preached on from the pulpit or talked about in RCIA or parish level Bible studies or the radio or most of the sort of the common places where more popular teaching is to be found, you're not likely to hear a whole lot of repetition of this material as being really central to who Jesus is. Okay, well, I want to tell you that is a mistake. It's an understandable mistake, or I should say maybe it's an error of omission. It's a lacuna. It's an understandable one, but I want to first go through just a little bit in Matthew, and we could do a similar exercise in Mark or Luke, and show really how eschatological Jesus really is. And once again, what do I mean by eschatological? I mean the central message of Jesus is about what's going to happen at the end. And in particular, the central thing in this eschatological picture is the coming of the kingdom. The coming of the kingdom, okay? There's not four last things, there's one last thing. Okay, the four last things came about because we're in the habit of kind of reinterpreting Jesus' eschatological message to be something about us and what happens to us when we die. We'll talk about that maybe in a little bit once we get into this. But just taking a look back at the very beginning in Matthew's presentation, you'll find something similar in Mark. Jesus starts to preach. This is after he's been tempted in the wilderness. And what happens? The very first words out of his mouth in Matthew 4:17 and 4:18 are, "From that time Jesus began to preach, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" Okay, that's the very first message that comes out of his mouth. That's exactly, by the way, what John the Baptist was preaching. So in some ways, there's continuity here between what Jesus is saying and what the Baptist is saying. Okay, several verses later, he pulls his Moses act, he goes up the mountain, he preaches the Sermon on the Mount, and what happens? How does that one start? It starts with the Beatitudes. Okay, notice the Beatitudes are all, "Blessed are, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Notice they're all present and future oriented. They're eschatological. What he's talking about is a condition now that's going to be a sign of a future reality in which what's true in this world will be, in effect, turned on its head, and it will be topsy-turvy. And the last shall become first, the first shall become last. He who has, more will be given. He who has not, what he literally has will be taken away. The weak will become strong. The powerful and the mighty will be overthrown. All of these sorts of things, which are often called the eschatological reversal, the great sort of moral inversion, all of this is part of the message. So notice the Sermon on the Mount starts this way. Okay, you can find lots of other references to the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount, but notice when we get to the very center of the Sermon on the Mount, what do we get to? The Lord's Prayer. It's right in the middle of the sermon, those three chapters. And what's the Lord's Prayer all about? "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come." Okay, and indeed, there's petitions. There's like 7 petitions, depending on how you count them in the sermon. Every single one of them is eschatological. Every single one of them has to do with what we are to pray for, to ask God for, given the reality of the coming of the kingdom, the breaking into the kingdom. Okay? we go on and continue through the Sermon on the Mount, and you don't have to go very far before you get to the end of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7, and again, the denouement is eschatological. Jesus tells the sermon, the little parable about the house on the rock. Every one of you who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who builds his house on the rock. And what happens? The house on the rock is the thing that survives. Everyone who doesn't hear the words of mine, well, what happened? You'll be the person who doesn't survive. Okay, the house on the rock is, of course, perhaps an early image of what the Catholic Church is to be, and perhaps it's even a foreshadowing of the office of Peter getting the keys to that kingdom, who maybe not coincidentally is also going to be named the rock. But the point here is that there's eschatological separation. That's another aspect of it. The faithful will survive. As the inbreaking of the kingdom comes, the wicked will be destroyed. The faithless will be removed. Okay, that's all eschatology. Similarly, the next big block of preaching you get to, Matthew 10. Jesus sends the disciples out on this, to preach the kingdom, to preach the message of Jesus is giving. The central piece is about the coming of the kingdom. That's, in a sense, the gospel message in Nuce. And what does he do? He tells them specifically how to preach, what to preach, and what's going to happen. For those who don't hear you, it will be better than Sodom and Gomorrah that will happen for that town, for the town that doesn't receive you. Okay? That's eschatological. Any kind of a threat like that is eschatological. Matthew 13, okay, the next block of preaching. This is the centerpiece of the entire Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 13 gives us all the parables of the kingdom, which indeed tell us more about the kingdom and how the kingdom is coming, despite all the opposition it's incurring. We've seen in the last several chapters, at least, the opposition is beginning to gather. The parable of the sower is, as we've seen before, very eschatological, showing how the kingdom will, in effect, succeed, even though it appears to be failing. How the force of God and God's word will triumph, even though the opposition to it is gathering. Several of the other parables do emphasize the greatness of the kingdom, but many others also emphasize this idea of eschatological separation. The parable of the wheat and the tares. The good wheat will be gathered into the barn. The tares will be taken off and burned. Okay, but in the interim, they will grow up together. Okay, so there's a period of time in the church, is how most people understand this, not everybody. They will grow up together. One will be taken, the other destroyed. Okay, similarly, the great fish harvest. You've got good fish and bad fish that come in the harvest. The good ones will be taken, the bad ones thrown away. Again, eschatological separation. All of this is eschatological. And indeed, by the time we get to Matthew 24 and 25, there's no question that Jesus is an eschatological preacher. There's no doubt about it. Okay, and in fact, leading into the Sermon on the Mount, we see two elements of what we've called in this class double tradition. These are found in Luke and they're found in Matthew. We find the warning of Jesus about those who shed the blood of Zechariah, so the son of Berechiah, are just like those in effect who shed the blood of Abel. So there's sort of a connection between all of these people in history who've been opposed to God, culminating with now, by implication, the people who are going to shed his blood, who are opposed to him. Truly, I say to you, all this will come upon this generation. That sounds pretty darn eschatological to me. When will this come upon the generation? Well, at the time of harvest, at the time of the judgment. He goes on and tells another eschatological saying, O Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, how I tried to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. Okay, behold, your house is forsaken and desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay, these are both double tradition sayings. Keep in mind, they are both highly eschatological. Now, I point this out not because you're so familiar with the debate, but in terms of the scholarly debate, this is a big contention you will hear among scholars, that the Q sayings, the supposed Q sayings, the double tradition sayings, are not very eschatological. There's not much eschatology in Q. Well, these two sayings are pretty darn eschatological. Okay, so liberals like John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, people of this ilk, have tried to sort of reconstruct a different kind of Jesus who's not really eschatological, and they've done it out of double tradition sayings and also other aspects of Gospel of Thomas, things like that. I don't want to get so much into that, but just to just tell you that this is actually one of the things you will encounter in some of the older threads of the literature, that the Q, if there is a Q, or double tradition is not eschatological. Well, this is an example of it being pretty darn eschatological here. Okay, so let's look at the Mount Olivet Discourse beginning in Matthew 24 with that. 24 verse 1, it says, Jesus left the temple and was going away. When his buildings came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, he answered them, saying, you see all those, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Okay, so the oracle against the temple comes out explicitly here. Now again, most of this, and indeed most of chapter 24, is carried over directly from the Gospel of Mark. It's very similar, the text. But here I want to point out that many people, particularly liberal scholars, but some other people who are influenced by liberal scholars, will argue that this is a so-called vaticinium ex eventu, and that is essentially a prophecy, but one that's made up after the fact, right? Remember, many people, and I actually hold this myself, believe that Matthew was written after the destruction of the temple, and so that they explain this prophecy as being simply written once the temple's gone, and wow, this is a cool thing to put this in the lips of Jesus. Well, what do we say to that? My answer is no way is this a vaticinium ex eventu. For one thing, a vaticinium ex eventu would be far, far more detailed than this. Okay, it would mention the Romans. It would get very specific about the war, perhaps even the dating, the 40-year period. It would have invoked a lot of very, very explicit things that we don't, in fact, find. And moreover, the problem with the vaticinium ex eventu theory is also that there is a more famous oracle concerning the temple. I shouldn't say more famous, but perhaps a more problematic oracle concerning the temple. And this one surfaces in the trial of Jesus in the Passion narrative, where Jesus is accused of saying, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days build another not made with hands. Now we'll see that Matthew also has a version of that charge and the sort of outcome of the charge in his gospel. So there is a point. This is not the kind of thing you would have made up, especially the 3-day thing. The 3-day thing is hard to understand. It's hard to explain. And indeed, if you really follow the whole question of the temple vis-a-vis the 3-day motif, you don't really get the explanation until the Gospel of John, in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John, and that's pretty cryptic at that point. So, again, this is classic prophecy. It's directionally dead on the money in terms of what it substantially predicts, although the details are a little bit thin and cryptic. So this is exactly the kind of thing that you would expect to see of an actual prediction that's in fact not made up after the fact. If Matthew wanted to make a vaticinium ex eventu, he would have embellished this greatly and added a lot of really vivid and highly accurate details from the Roman War of 67 to 70. Okay, the fact he didn't do so should cause us profound skepticism about the vaticinium ex eventu theory. In fact, I think in terms of prophecy, this is probably one of the best examples of biblical prophecy in sort of the classical sense, the sense that most people understand it as being a prediction of the future. Now, we could get into a whole other lesson that prophecy in the Bible is really not fundamentally about prediction of the future, but nevertheless, this is one of the easier ones to defend as being historically accurate. So I wanted to make that before we dive in. And then, of course, he sits in the Mount of Olives. This is where we get the term Mount Olivet Discourse or Little Olivet Discourse. Why little? Because it compares much, much more diminutively to the maximum apocalypse that we're going to see in the gospel in the book of Revelation. And indeed, it's worth pointing out, not only is this eschatological, it is also apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic classically means to reveal, okay, to basically take something out of hiding and to reveal it. But in point of fact, apocalyptic literature tends to be highly coded. It tends to be highly cryptic. It tends to be highly symbolic. It tends to be highly difficult to understand, and indeed, it's designed to be classic insider discourse. It's resistance literature. It's the kind of literature that oppressed people will talk to themselves about what's going to happen, but doing so in such a way that's encoded so that they don't run afoul of the powers that be. That would be the general idea of it. So apocalyptic literature is this, and this seems to have some of the characteristics of apocalypse. Jesus goes on to predict the emergence of false Christs, the emergence of wars, rumors of wars, the coming persecution. Indeed, notice that the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is coming amidst great suffering, tribulations, and difficulties for the elect people of God. That's pretty clear. You see that all throughout the New Testament. You see it in the apocalyptic literature of the Old Testament. Indeed, going back once again to the Lord's Prayer, that one kind of questionable petition, lead us not into temptation, classically speaking, that should be understood as lead us not to the parousia, the test. Do not lead us to the test, Lord, because we will not pass the test if we are brought to it, okay, amidst the kingdom coming. So this is actually a petition to be spared from something. It's much, much more historically contingent idea than this idea of sort of everyday temptations to commit sin that most Christians think of. At any rate, go on. So he effectively says that the elect, the ones that persevere, will be saved. That's always the message of apocalyptic literature. Yeah, it's bad, but just hold out a little bit longer because eventually you'll be vindicated. Then you get to 24:15 and the mention of the abomination of desolation. This is language borrowed directly from the book of Daniel, which most people see as referring to the insertion into the temple of the statue of Zeus by Antiochus Epiphanes, the satrap, the pagan satrap, this great abomination of desolation. And then in verse 15, in the second half of the verse, Matthew breaks the fourth wall. And if you know what break the fourth wall means, break the fourth wall is essentially the idea is you're in a TV show and the set has two sides to it and a back, and if it's a live TV show, the fourth wall will be the one in front of you, and that's the one that the audience is looking on. Okay, so when you break that fourth wall, you're in effect speaking directly to the audience. Okay, and once in a while that will happen. Once in a while, a TV show, the person, the character will speak directly to the audience, directly to the camera. Okay, or give a wink directly to the camera. So it's funny when that happens. It's profoundly ironic because it shows you that the audience, in effect, and this particular character knows something that maybe the other characters in the story don't know. Okay, this is an example, the only I'm aware of actually in the New Testament, where the text speaks directly to the reader. It says, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," parentheses, "let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not go down into his house, and let him not." Him who is not in the field not turn back to get his mantle. Okay, this is taken, by the way, this breaking of the fourth wall, that let the reader understand clause is taken over directly from Mark also. Again, this is probably about the clearest proof that you're ever going to find that there's literary dependence between them. This only makes sense if one's borrowing from the other's writings. Okay, so in Mark, however, it's more deeply ironic because you have this whole sort of motif of discovery of Jesus and who are the insiders, and the apocalyptic literature, which is designed to, in effect, divide the insiders from the outsiders. There's a real play in that irony in Mark, and so this speaking directly to the reader is itself, in effect, pulling the reader into the irony as well. This doesn't work quite as profoundly with Matthew, but it still goes to suggest that you, the reader, understand this motif and what this desolating sacrilege is, which is great because I don't know what it is, and and I'm reading this now, and you don't either, and no one really knows for sure. Some people have argued that it really just refers to the crucifixion itself. That's possible. Something else perhaps happened afterwards. We don't really know. Again, all of this is language that's borrowed from the Old Testament. It's stock imagery, not only from Daniel, but from Jeremiah, from Isaiah, from Zechariah, from Zephaniah. Okay, these are largely stock images associated with horrific events that happened in Jewish history and in the history of Israel in the past. Okay, particularly the events of 587 when the temple itself was destroyed. That's kind of the template for all of this, of how this destruction and defeat happens, and how the people of God, the true people of God, are to survive it. Okay, so you kind of get to the punchline as the chapter goes on. There's a whole bunch of advice that Jesus gives. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. So again, the emergence of false Christs, all of these things are going to happen. And then in verse 29, Judge jumping down here, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the tribes in the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Heaven coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So wow, this sounds, like really the end, the apocalypse here. And this is, of course, the great challenge of interpreting this chapter, and indeed the great challenge of interpreting all apocalyptic literature. What is it actually supposed to refer to? Again, the context up to this point is the great turmoil and increased international intrigue, and the heightened argumentation, the tribulations before the coming of the Lord. But this also seems to be tied to the destruction of the temple. So are we talking here about the destruction of the temple and the Roman war and all the tribulations and persecutions that happened in the year 67 to 70 AD, roughly 40 years after Jesus was crucified? Or are we talking about the end of the world? Okay? And this is the great problem. The text seems in various places to point one or the other direction. Okay? It's hard in a way to make sense of this. Now, I will tell you, most, and I'm perhaps a little biased in saying this, but most sophisticated readers of apocalyptic literature, and this would include the apocalyptic elements of the synoptic gospels. We have a parallel element in Mark chapter 13. There's two chapters in Luke 17 and Luke 21 that do this. And of course also the book of Revelation. Most sophisticated interpreters understand this largely in a preterist fashion. What's a preterist fashion? Indeed, looking back on this as something that we should understand as primarily something that's already happened in the past from our perspective. Okay, this is a prediction of something that was future from the time horizon of the person giving the prediction, but as we look back on it, we should understand this primarily as something that has already happened. Okay, that's the preterist view. Okay, most Christians, especially the ones who have radio forums, on the AM stations that not too many people listen to, but but there's actually a fair audience for them, see this primarily not as preterist, but primarily future. In other words, something that we should be looking for now. I think, in a way, our sort of grounding has to be within the preterist model. In other words, we have to see this primarily within the context that it's given. It primarily refers to specific events within the time horizon of Jesus' immediate audience themselves. And how do you know that? Well, look, he tells them this in verse 24:32. He says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know the summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Wow. Okay. So this is sort of the kind of two-step that we often have to take when interpreting this. We have to kind of ground ourselves in this idea of preterism. In other words, that to make sense of this, to take seriously what the text actually says, you have to see this as referring to things that are in the time horizon of the immediate audience to whom these oracles were originally given. But there's this whole question of interpretation, what the Bible meant then, what it means, and there's definitely a gap in time and historical context that we have to take into account of. There are secondary applications to this, and indeed, when we're thinking about what the parousia, the final coming of Jesus, is going to be like, this is a text we would look at, okay? And indeed, even if we have to kind of catch it backhanded to kind of understand what it would mean for us. Okay, so this becomes a problem, you see, then, to interpret this, a little bit of a problem, potentially, to interpret this after the time of the temple's destruction and the war was over. Why? Because what do we do with the part about the parousia? What do we do with the part about these earth-shattering consequences of that? The sun darkening, the moon turning to blood, all the tribes of the earth gathering together. What do we do with that? How do we interpret that? Because we don't want to become what I would call hyper-preterist, in that we get so locked into the preterist model that we say, oh, okay, so in 70 AD, the full kingdom came, and it's here right now, and it's arrived, and here it is. And believe it or not, there are people in the world who do believe that. If you Google preterism, you'll see that there are preterist communities around, and they look at verses like this and take very, very scientific, historically minded interpretations of them and say, well, okay, this is what Matthew said. He said that the kingdom would come. Jesus said the kingdom would come at the destruction of the temple. The parousia would come, and so it must have happened, and this must be it. We're living then in the fullness of the kingdom now. We've got everything we're ever going to get. The glory of God has been revealed. The full light of Easter shines in the world today. Now, if you're going to say, oh, God, how could anyone believe that? There's so many things wrong with the world today. That couldn't possibly be right. Well, yeah, you're right. But you see the problem here. There's this kind of eschatological tension, if you will, between what's here and what's not yet. And indeed, the kind of problem here is, how do we reconcile the fullness of this with what we haven't had yet. So I think the best way is to kind of treat this using Augustine's theory of signs. These words are words. They point to things. The things are the things signed, but those things to which these words report to, which are events in the past, are themselves signs for future realities. And indeed, when we look at the connection between these events in the past and what's going to happen in the future when the Lord finally does appear, there'll be a connection between sign and signified, between signa and signata. Okay, in other words, there'll be a connection from one to the other, between word and thing. Okay, now that's of course one way to take this. Another way to take this is within the disappointed future model. Okay, the disappointed future model would say, hey, look, Jesus predicted the coming of the kingdom then. clearly that didn't happen. You all know that didn't happen, so ergo, the prediction is wrong. What are we going to do? Okay, so you'll find this view expressed. This is actually a very common view also, particularly among critical New Testament scholars, going back to the great Albert Schweitzer, who had his heyday, right around 100 years or so ago. Schweitzer did a lot of good work, by the way, in really raising the profile of the eschatology in the New Testament. But you see, this is a classic problem with eschatology in the New Testament. What do you do with it? It seems hard to interpret, hard to make sense of, and it seems even potentially slightly embarrassing, because it seems possibly to have predicted something in the past that didn't happen. Well, I don't think we can completely solve that charge here, but notice that what Matthew does as he continues on, and I'm going to skip the part about Noah and the analogy of the taken away and left story, to jump to the three parables that Matthew gives us at the end of 24 and into chapter 25. Notice Matthew loves threes. Now, all of these parables take the Markan theme of eschatological vigilance. In other words, we need to be waiting for and alert for the coming of the Lord, the parousia of the Lord, because we don't know when it's going to be. It could happen any time. Okay, we need to be vigilant. But the thing that Matthew does that's really unique is he potentially seems to be perhaps slightly aware of the problem that I mentioned regarding the fear or the concern that these prophecies had not been fulfilled, or not, or there's disappointment because Jesus promised the whole coming of the kingdom, and all we got was a war and the destruction of the temple. Okay, if you notice in each of these parables, the parable of the faithful and the wise servant, the parable of the 10 virgins, and the parable of the talents, each of them introduces the element of the master returning, but after a long delay, chronizo. Okay, look in chapter 25, verse 48. The wicked master leaves the householder to take care of things. Okay, this is the idea of the Lord leaving and then coming back. And verse 48 says, "But the wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed." Okay, the element of delay perhaps is the issue at hand here. If we're in fact to look for something much greater in the future than what had happened, looking back on it from Matthew's perspective, the element of delay is important. This is a slight adaptation of the idea of eschatological vigilance. Now we need to be vigilant over a much longer time horizon. Again, similarly, the 10 virgins also have this theme of delay. Okay, it is mentioned, but let's see here. As the bridegroom was delayed, the 10 virgins slumbered and slept. Okay, so that's 25:5. It comes up again in 25:14. The man is going on a journey, calling his servants, leaving them behind, and he goes away for a very long time. Okay, and it tells us explicitly that there's a long time that he is gone. Let me see if I can find it here. Sorry, I should have marked this before. Verse 19, now after palukranu, a long time, the master of the servants came and settled the accounts with them. In other words, this motif of delay and long time is important because from the perspective of Matthew, especially if he really is written after the destruction of the temple and looking back on these the wars and things like that as having occurred in the past, there is indeed the issue of, the audience now needs to be aware that the full parousia, might be a very long time in coming. And indeed, sure enough, 2,000 years later, we're still waiting for that fullness. Okay, now, is a delay of the parousia a problem? Okay, is a delay of the parousia a problem? Assuming that there is a delay of the parousia, and I think we need to be at least open to the possibility that, the original audience of Jesus may have expected a return perhaps much earlier than the one that we're going to end up getting. Okay, is that a problem? It's a problem for liberal scholars. Okay, and why is that? Okay, it's primarily a problem for them because they stop believing in the resurrection. I think N.T. Wright is dead on the money there, because they stop believing in all that had happened in the past with Jesus' resurrection, and therefore they put all of the emphasis on what's going to happen in the future, and indeed, then it really does become a problem. Then, the very core of the gospel's credibility is threatened, for them. Okay, so I think that's probably the most I'm going to say here about the issue of the delay of the parousia. But keep in mind, if you dive into the commentary at all on Matthew's little Olivet discourse, you'll find quite a bit on the parousia, the delay of the parousia, and the preterist interpretation, and indeed the future interpretation as well. And I think a good interpretation model that we will have is sort of a moderately preterist motion, saying, yeah, this basically did happen in the past, but it still refers in some kind of a symbolic way, but a very real way, to future events that have yet to unfold. Now, the message is, when the kingdom is coming, toward the end of chapter 24, nobody knows when it's coming, right? Nobody knows when it's coming, although there's a lot in Matthew that suggests it's soon, or sooner rather than later, and indeed other New Testament. Matthew tends to want to stretch out our expectations a little bit. So again, this is important. Then he goes on to say, as was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days, the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving to marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they did not know until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be with the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one is left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one is taken, one is left. Watch therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the householder had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have watched, and he would not let his house be broken into. Therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Now, notice a couple of things about this. This is popularly misunderstood, not in the Catholic Church, but in usually evangelical churches, of which they're full of new converts who are unfamiliar with even the historic evangelical doctrines of eschatology and have latched on to this relatively new idea of rapture, which has become very popular in our own day and age. What's wrong with the theory of rapture? This is going to be one of the classic rapture proof texts that Christians will point to. What's wrong? Well, first of all, notice in the days of Noah. Okay, what happens in the days of Noah? Well, 2 things. There's a flood, and what happens? People are swept away. Who's swept away? Who's taken away in the flood story? The bad people. Who are saved? Who stays? Who remains? The good people. Okay? So notice that, he goes on to talk about, 1 woman, 2 women grinding, one will be taken, one will be left. What's the other one here? One working in the field, 2 working in the field, 1 taken, the other left. Who's going to be taken? It's the bad people. Okay, the good people will be left. Okay, so that should be our slogan. In the event of rapture, I hope I'm left, because that's kind of the whole point. When the coming of the Son of Man happens, this parousia, that's going to be the time in which the evil will be removed. The whole evil purge will be purged from the earth, and indeed the whole world will be restored, with the effects of sin and death removed, and the children of God will reign over it. And you get probably a wider view of that in the Pauline letters, but that's clear. And by the way, this idea of parousia also is a very technical term. Okay, you find it used frequently in Jesus' own sayings. It's used frequently in Paul's letters as well. A parousia is when a ruler from outside of a city or a particular realm. So, for instance, a lot of times in the ancient world, a ruler who commands a large area, will have various cities throughout his empire, and he might decide to come and visit one of his cities. Okay, when he does, that's called a parousia. It literally means a presence, an official visit. Okay, and that's the image that's being conjured up here. And so when you see this idea of rapture, this is another passage that's frequently misunderstood along with rapture. This is Thessalonians. Okay, so in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul says, "For we would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning those who are asleep, that is, who have died, that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep," i.e. died. "For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself," he's talking here about the parousia, this official presence, "the Lord will descend from heaven with the cry of command of the archangel's call, and the sound of the trumpet of God," which is exactly what you'd expect when an emperor enters a city. There's going to be great fanfare. Okay, there's going to be a celebration of him coming. "And the dead in Christ will rise first, and we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air," which could also mean in the spirit, but let's take in the air, "and we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words." But the point is, then what happens? Okay, Paul doesn't say this, but he's assuming that the audience knows the idea. Okay, when the tribe, the people of the empire, come out of the city walls to meet the emperor when he's coming, okay, the emperor doesn't take them away to some other place. No, the whole idea is that they will be there to escort the emperor into the kingdom. In other words, it's exactly the opposite of rapture. They're being, in effect, they're going to lead him in to assume his throne, his rightful reign over the realm. Okay, so the idea is not sucking the people out of earth, okay? It's indeed ushering the king and the kingdom into the world, okay? That's the key. Now, many evangelicals have this misunderstanding about rapture, but I have to tell you, this is rooted in sloppy teaching that you find even among the Catholic Church and mainline Protestant denominations, which really suggests an idea that the whole idea of the human life, the Christian life, is to get out of the world. But it's not. The fundamental message of Jesus is that the kingdom is coming, okay? Not that you're going to be pulled out to the kingdom, okay? That's the key. And if we had more time, I always say we had more time, we could do something. But again, bear that in mind when you're doing your preaching and teaching on this, okay? Well, that's probably one of the reasons why you tend not to hear this preached so much in the Catholic world. Okay, that's one reason for it. The other reason is that just in general, and this is something that's generally true in our society, for at least the last several hundred years, we are very uncomfortable with eschatology in general, and particularly apocalyptic eschatology in particular. Why? Well, think about it. What do you associate apocalyptic eschatology with? All right? Something like this, or this, or this, or something like this, or this. Okay? You get the idea, right? You don't think Son of God coming to earth to reveal God. You think crazy, nutty, unhinged street preacher. And indeed, this is one of the reasons why you don't see eschatology mentioned too much in Christian preaching, and indeed why you could even see that that people, especially in the last several hundred years, have really tried in various ways to downplay the idea of Jesus really even being an eschatological apocalyptic teacher at all, and have really wanted to present him more as a teacher, sort of teaching timeless moral truths for the long haul. Okay. Not so much concerned about the coming of the kingdom, the end of the world, that sort of thing. Mainly interpreting the coming of the kingdom purely in terms of wisdom. And now you see some scholars who go the full 9 yards with that, but that idea is actually implicit in a lot of popular presentations of Jesus, including ones you'll hear in the Catholic Church. But indeed, there's simply no way to have this kind of understanding of Jesus that doesn't put eschatology at the center and still be honest to the data of the New Testament, in which eschatology, the coming of the kingdom, is something that's mentioned at practically every turn. You hear then the great final judgment parable, in which really is about corporal works of mercy, visiting the people in prison, visiting, clothing the poor, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, that sort of thing. This is a very, very essential element there of Jesus' eschatology, and that is a very unique aspect to it too. There's lots of eschatological writings in Judaism of the day, and indeed in the centuries before Jesus, but none that I'm aware of has really emphasized, as Jesus does, the importance of corporal works of mercy at a time when the judgment is imminent. Okay, that's a very, very unique aspect. I think we'd have to concede, and only Jesus is really responsible for this, as far as I know. So, and just so you know, in case you're a little confused, what I'm talking about here is Jesus tells this parable about the coming of the kingdom. This is the very end of Matthew 25, and he says, "Come, all blessed, my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will come to him and say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, feed you?" And so on and so forth. And then, of course, you get to the saying when he says, "What you did for the least of these brethren, you did for me." So what I think is so beautiful about this is that it really ties together the moral demands of the kingdom with this idea of eschatology, and how heightened the demands are precisely because the kingdom is coming, and is coming soon. Okay, so that's the little Olivet Discourse. Again, this is a scholarly favorite. You will find so much written on these chapters in the literature, but there's been so relatively little said and preached on this in terms of teaching that's really designed for lay people. So I will tell you, in your own teaching, for those of you who are teachers and catechists, one of the real neglected areas of Jesus is anything to do with this in terms of eschatology, because it will be the kind of thing that Catholics will read and either let it go in one ear and out the other, or will misinterpret to mean about their own death, which is coming and will probably come before the end of the world or the return of Jesus, the great parousia, the great coming. So, there's actually a lot of good teaching that can be done there that is soundly biblical, and is a very helpful reminder of things that tend to be neglected in our own day. Okay, and what else did I want to tell you? I think that's it primarily, and yeah, so we'll stop right there.